I'm wondering this morning, when was the last time you had a day off? A day off. And what did you do with it? Was it life-giving? Here in North America, many people live for the weekend. They put up with work or school, maybe from Monday to Friday because they have to. But come the weekend, they can kick back and do as they please. How many of you would say the weekend is your favorite time of the week? One or two people anyway. I learned in my preparations this week that the concept of the weekend is actually fairly recent. For most of history, the work week was 6 or even 7 days. Now, in North America, having Sundays off has been a tradition for probably a couple of hundred years to let people go to church on Sundays, and I'm not sure how many people actually do that anymore. But according to one source, the biggest impotence for the weekend happened in 1926, in the U.S. anyway, when Henry Ford shut down his factories on Saturday and Sunday. And Ford realized that his best customers might be his own employees. And he wanted them to be able to enjoy the cars that they were building. So that allowed him to sell more cars. So by 1938, the federal government of the U.S. mandated a 40-hour work week, and the weekend became a national idea. I think leaders began to recognize at a national level that there was a need to have time off for the health and the sanity of its people. Of course, God has known from the beginning of creation and modeled this concept of Sabbath right from the beginning. In Genesis chapter 2, we read this: by the seventh day, God had finished all of his work that he was doing, and so he rested from all his work. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, did he rest because he was exhausted? Did he rest because he was burned out? I think that's unlikely. I think it's more likely that God paused to take delight in all that he had made. And God instituted the Sabbath rest for humankind by including it in the Ten Commandments, a portion of which we read just a few moments ago. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is on the screen. As the Lord your God has commanded you. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but in the seventh day, that day is a day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. It seems like from the earliest days, there has been controversy over what it actually means to observe the Sabbath. Even within the commandments, there's more commentary on this particular commandment in terms of how to keep it than there is for any of the others. Mostly the others just say, thou shalt not kill, but remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There's quite a bit of extra commentary to show us how to do it. It's as if God was saying to us, in case you're wondering what this means. There's a slide for this. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your oxen and donkeys, and other livestock. Any foreigners living among you, all your male and female servants must rest as you do. So there's quite a bit of commentary on the Sabbath keeping. But we continue to wrestle with what it means to observe the Sabbath. When I was growing up, it meant attending morning and evening services and having a nap in between. That is after our big Sunday dinner, which my mom had worked hard to prepare before the service for us and our guests. We didn't go to a restaurant on Sundays. Then again, our family never went to a restaurant at all, so we didn't miss that much. We didn't buy anything on Sundays. We didn't do any yard work. We didn't play any sports. We couldn't go swimming. I began to dread Sundays because it was a day full of things that I couldn't do. Now, eventually my parents began to relax a little bit, and we began to doing things previously we hadn't been able to. Some of you remember the name Eric Liddell of Chariots of Fire fame. He was known as the fastest runner in Scotland in his day. And he refused to run in his top event, the 100-meter race at the Paris Olympics in 1924, because the heats for that fell on a Sunday. He was very strict about his Sabbath keeping. We'll come back to him in a few moments. In today's gospel reading, Jesus and his disciples are in trouble again with the religious leaders, and it has to do with Sabbath keeping. He's in trouble specifically with the Pharisees. It's interesting. We're only into the second chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and this is the fourth time, even within that chapter, that Jesus has offended the religious establishment. First, it was about the forgiving of the sins of the paralytic man. Then it was eating with tax collectors. Then his disciples weren't fasting like John's were. And now his disciples were breaking the Sabbath. They were harvesting grain. A few verses later, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees start plotting to kill Jesus. We're only 79 verses into the story of Jesus in Mark, and already the Pharisees want to destroy him. So things have escalated very, very quickly in this gospel. And to us, this matter of harvesting grain seems so trivial. Why would you get so upset about that? The disciples are simply walking through a field on their way to some destination on a Sabbath Saturday afternoon. And as they go, they pluck some grain from the strands around them, rub it between their fingers, and just snack on it. Why is this so upsetting to the Pharisees? Well, to be fair to the Pharisees, we need to understand how important Sabbath keeping was in first century Judaism. Keeping the Sabbath wasn't only a religious duty, it was an important part of their national identity. To them, it set them apart from the various Gentile ethnicities that surrounded them. This was a distinctive, and they wanted to protect it. It was also driven by their messianic hopes and their desire not to incur the wrath of God. They took the words of the prophet Jeremiah very, very seriously, who had warned them about this much earlier, and chastised the Israelites for not keeping the Sabbath, and giving them stern warnings about what would happen if they continued this way. And this is on the screen. This is what the Lord says according to Jeremiah. "Do not do your work on the Sabbath, but make it a holy day. I gave this commandment to you and your ancestors, but they did not listen or obey. If you do not listen to me and refuse to keep the Sabbath holy, then I will set fire to these gates. The fire will spread to the palaces, and no one will be able to put out the roaring flames." So this is a dire warning, and it's still ringing in the ears of these religious establishment. On the other hand, Jeremiah also said in the same passage, and I think this is also on the screen, "If you keep the Sabbath holy, then kings and their officials will go in and out of these gates forever. There will always be a descendant of David sitting on the throne here in Jerusalem. Kings and their officials will always ride in and out among the people of Judah in chariots and horses, and the city will remain forever." So this is a messianic hope for the Jewish people. Expectations about the Sabbath keeping and about the coming of the Messiah actually eventually escalated to the point not long after Jesus' day, where some actually believed that if the whole nation could keep the two consecutive Sabbaths perfectly, so if everybody observed the Sabbath perfectly for 2 consecutive weeks, the Messiah would come. So, they were very serious about this. So even though there was this commentary within the Ten Commandments about what it means to keep the Sabbath, there's still quite a bit of ambiguity there. We're not supposed to do any work, but what does work mean? Well, the Pharisees took it upon themselves to spell this out in detail, and they were being extra careful so that people wouldn't even come close to breaking the Sabbath commandment. It's like putting up a tall fence to keep you from climbing over a shorter fence that was in front of it. So now even rubbing rubbing little bits of grain between your fingers was considered work. Walking more than 960 meters from your house on a Sabbath day was considered work. And there were many other rules like this. And so it became a lot of work just trying not to do any work on the Sabbath. It took all the joy out of that day of rest. So how does Jesus respond to this accusation that the disciples are breaking the Sabbath? He doesn't disregard the Sabbath. He doesn't say, well, that's old-fashioned. We're not bound by that anymore. He interprets the meaning of the Sabbath differently. And the way he goes about doing this is kind of interesting. He doesn't go back to the Genesis account and talk about how God paused to delight in his creation. Instead, he tells a story about a time when David and his men were on the run from King Saul. David had already been appointed king by Samuel by this point, but Saul was still on the throne and very jealous of David. In fact, trying to kill David. So David and company were hiding wherever they could, and so desperate for food that at one point, David goes into the house of worship at a village, the village of Nob, and he asks the priest there to give him some of the sacred bread, which is all they would have had in the place. And this was only reserved for priests. Now that priest that was on duty understood that this was a matter of survival for David. And he understood also that as king, David was higher in authority than any priest. And so he gives David this sacred bread to eat. Now, by telling this story, Jesus is comparing himself and his disciples to David and his men. And like David, he had a higher authority than the religious establishment to interpret what it means to keep the Sabbath. And he's very explicit about this when he says, "So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." And it's this claim in particular that really gets the Pharisees riled up. And what is the purpose of the Sabbath according to Jesus? It's on the screen. The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is important. It's still important today, but it's supposed to be a gift and not a burden. It's about restoration and freedom, not something that increases your stress and gives you ulcers. And Mark drives this home by immediately telling another story about Jesus healing on the Sabbath. Jesus goes into the synagogue on a Sabbath day, and there happens to be a man there with a deformed hand. And the Pharisees are watching him to see if he will heal on the Sabbath. And if he does, they're ready to accuse him again of doing work on the Sabbath. Maybe they think that healing somebody is even more obviously work than a bit of running your grain through your fingers. Now, clearly they didn't think that spying on Jesus to catch him breaking the law was breaking the Sabbath. Jesus is aware of what they're thinking, and he's so upset with the way they interpret the Sabbath that he decides to set the record straight in front of the whole group that are gathered there in the synagogue. Now, this man with a deformed hand doesn't ask to be healed. He likely knew that this would incur the wrath of the Pharisees. But Jesus calls him out and has him stand up in front of the whole crowd. And he turned to his critics and asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath?" Which, in fact, it does. "Or is it a day for doing evil?" Of course, it's not a day for doing evil. "Is this a day to save life or to destroy it?" But the Pharisees wouldn't answer him. They would have been condemning themselves. They remained silent. The purpose of the Sabbath: doing good, saving life. Clearly not a day for doing evil or destroying life. So Jesus restores this man's hand, but this was more than a simple act of kindness. Now this man was able to work again. He was able to support his family. He's able to live with dignity. Jesus, in fact, is setting this man free. Ironically, the Pharisees on that Sabbath day went out and began to plot how they would kill Jesus. Who was breaking the Sabbath? If we go back to the reading in Deuteronomy, we see that God gives a Sabbath as a gift, not as a burden. This is on the screen. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. And this gift is for everyone. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants. You could read employees there. Your oxen, donkeys, other livestock. Foreigners might read immigrant workers. All your male and female servants. We're all supposed to rest. This is a gift for everyone. And this gift is about freedom. The verse goes on, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. So in Egypt, the Israelites were slaves, and they worked all the time. There was no long weekends. In fact, there was no weekends at all. There were no days off. But God was delivering them from that, and they were no longer to impose those conditions on anyone else. Sabbath is for everyone. And none of us are wired to work without ceasing, even if it's good work. And that's why the Sabbath is written into the commandments. God is not imposing an obligation on us. God is gifting us with what we actually need. And going back to Eric Liddell for a moment, I learned a little bit more about Eric Liddell, Scotland's fastest runner. And I began to wonder, this isn't a fact, I just was curious in my own mind. I began to wonder whether he saw the Sabbath as an obligation or a gift. We know that he refused to run the 100-meter race, his best race at the Paris Olympics, because it was on a Sunday. But years later, while he was serving as a missionary in China, he was confined to a Japanese internment camp during the Second World War. No one at that camp had a bad word to say about him. He invested everything in it. He was helping everybody. He poured himself into the well-being of each person in the camp. He was helping the elderly. He was teaching Bible studies. He was arranging games. He was teaching science to the children. He was refereeing sports, organizing square dances, all kinds of stuff. He died at the camp at the age of 43. In his last letter to his wife, written on the day he died, Liddell wrote about the suffering he endured through a nervous breakdown due to overwork. So I began to wonder, did he know the Sabbath as an obligation that kept him from competing in a race on Sunday, but failed to receive it as a gift that allowed him to rest from all of his efforts to serve others? Why is it important for us to hear about all of this today? I think because with all of our labor-saving technology, some of us continue to work ourselves to death. We have computers to help us get our work done, but our computers go with us everywhere, if not in the form of a laptop, in the form of a cell phone. We can work all the time. I can work all the time. In my case, there's at least 8 different ways that you can get in touch with me at any time of the day, whether I'm in my office or not. And I won't tell you what they all are in case you decide to prank me. Recent studies have shown that 50 to 55% of the workers in both the United States and the United Kingdom fail to take the paid time off that their jobs offer. Half the population aren't taking their vacations, at least not all of them. Why not? Well, there's various reasons, I'm sure. They don't want to leave their fellow workers high and dry. They don't want to disappoint their boss. They're afraid of the work piling up, and they'll have just a lot more to do when they get back. Or sometimes you have to work so hard just to be able to create the space to take a bit of time off. But studies have shown time and again that work without rest actually results in a loss of productivity. It results in clouded thinking, a loss of imagination, increased stress, which leads to various forms of breakdown both in our mental health and our physical health. So working constantly actually isn't getting us further ahead. either at a personal level or at a business level. In fact, it's probably getting us further behind. So what does it look like for us to keep the Sabbath? I think we should remember, first of all, that Sabbath keeping is a spiritual practice. The commandment says, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. So it's actually not about doing just whatever we want. It's about doing what God wants. And so we need to be mindful of God in our Sabbath keeping. And gathering like this on a Sunday morning helps to keep us mindful of God. In the gospel that we read today, we read that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So here's a challenging question for us. Am I willing to let Jesus be Lord of my Sabbath? Am I willing to let him interpret what my Sabbath should look like? Your pastor isn't the Lord of your Sabbath. Jesus is. So I can't tell you exactly what you can and can't do on the Sabbath. But this is something that we should consider prayerfully with our Lord. A Sabbath that's honoring to the Lord is likely going to be a pause from whatever else you've been doing all week. A Sabbath is likely going to be life-giving for you and for the people around you. Ideally, it won't put an additional burden on other people. Remember, the Sabbath is God's gift for everyone. Finally, when we read Jesus saying today that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, we should recognize that he is associating himself very closely with Sabbath. And this is great news for us this morning. We do face many real pressures. Taking a bit of time off doesn't make those pressures go away. But Jesus' invitation to us is this: come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Rest not because the pressures are suddenly gone, but rest because we don't carry them alone. Rest because we can trust God to see us through and bring us ultimately into his eternal rest. We're closing this morning by celebrating the Lord's Supper. In receiving the bread and wine, we remember that the Lord offered up his life for us. We don't earn our salvation. We rest in it. We rest in what God has already accomplished for us. We serve one another. We do our work out of that place of rest. On the final night, the night that Jesus was arrested himself, he took bread and he broke it. And he gave it to his disciples and said, "Eat this in remembrance of me." And then he took the cup and he poured some wine into it. And he offered it to his disciples. And he said, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you're remembering what I've done for you until that day when I return again. So this morning, I'm going to invite you in just a moment to come and receive these gifts. And perhaps as you come to the table to receive the bread and the cup, or perhaps as you return and wait for everyone else to be served, you could be talking with the Lord about what your next Sabbath will look like. What's his invitation to you today? Will you use it to help out a neighbor? Will you maybe use it to turn off your social media channels for a whole day? Just not be bothered with them. Take a rest from them. Maybe get an extra hour of sleep. Will you read that novel that's been sitting by your bedside for the last several weeks or months? Will you sit and listen to that favorite album without doing anything else but just enjoying it for the pure pleasure of it? Will you read through a gospel? Lots of ways to honor the Sabbath. And I encourage you to have that conversation with the Lord. Decide tentatively what you're going to do and write it onto your calendar. But now I invite you to come. And if you're new to this congregation, everyone is welcome at this table. You don't have to be a member of the church. This table is for everyone who is a follower of Jesus. And if you haven't made that decision to follow Jesus yet, you can make that decision by taking these elements today. And we would certainly encourage you to talk about that decision with someone before you leave. I'm going to invite the elders and the worship team first to come, and I'll serve them. And then as they take their place at the table, the rest of you can fall in and come to the Lord's table that's been prepared for you.